Dead by Daylight's killer meta has always been very simple. Slap on Ruin, slap on some chase perks, and Bob's your uncle. Now, that's not to say the favourable perks never changed at all. Early on in Dead by Daylight's lifespan, Brutal Strength was an absolute must-have on almost every single killer, as back then, Brutal Strength granted an almighty 40% faster pallet break speed, and the base pallet break speed was something ridiculous like 2 seconds. Of course, nowadays that's no longer the case. Base pallet breaking speed is noticeably faster, and Brutal Strength's strength was halved, making its difference almost unnoticeable, causing Brutal Strength to go from a total must-have to somewhat of a meme perk, only ever seeing frequent use in combination with Fire Up, Bamboozle, and Save the Best for Last in sort of a powerhouse build, making just about everything faster than normal for the killer, including gens. But other than extremely rare cases like Brutal Strength, no other perks have been too impactful for killers. Of course, some perks were better than others, and eventually Hex Undying came into the picture, turning Ruin into Super Ruin. The meta for killers was set in stone. You will build Ruin if you want the best chance at winning. The breadwinner for killers was always Ruin. That's one thing that never changed for the longest time. Even when it got reworked for being used too often, its reworked version remained just as popular as its predecessor. In order to understand how Ruin lost its place as the single best perk for killers in Dead by Daylight, I must first explain what exactly made Ruin so prominent for so many years prior. Original Ruin. Ruin's original release was all the way back in December of 2016, among the first of a brand new concept of killer perks, Hex perks. The idea of a Hex perk was quite an unusual experimental design, placing extreme power into a perk far beyond what would typically be allowed, paired with the downside that the enemy team could outright take the perk away from you entirely for the remainder of the match. And all three of the original Hex perks, Ruin, Third Seal, and Devour Hope, were extremely powerful if they didn't get broken. Back then, players weren't as good at the game, so even Third Seal was no laughing matter. But right from the get-go, Ruin was already one step ahead of the other two Hex perks for one simple reason. Ruin was active at full potential the second the match began, whereas Third Seal and Devour Hope required stacking or applying it to survivors manually before any value could be seen, and there was always a possibility for the Hex to be broken before it got the chance to do anything. Over the years, Ruin became more and more valuable, and not due to the result of direct changes to the perk itself. One of the major contributors was that gens were starting to pop faster and faster, and this was simply because survivors were getting better at the game, wasting less time and focusing on their objectives more. Ruin's effect was quite simple. When repairing a generator, any good skill checks would cause the generator to regress 5% and pause repairing for a moment. So survivors had to hit great skill checks every single time, or else they'd take longer to repair the generators. Due to the new issue arising of faster generator completion alongside Ruin's design making it a totally unmatched generator slowdown perk, Ruin became unbelievably valuable, even with the downside of survivors being able to disable the perk entirely if they find the Hex. Outside of simply slowing down gens, which is beneficial to every killer, no matter how high up or low down in the tier list they are, the original Ruin had a much needed side effect of helping weaker killers clutch onto a shred of viability. This was due to Ruin's early game slowdown effect. The most important part of a killer's match is the early game, the first few minutes of the match or how long the first couple of gens take to be completed. If you have a rough early game as a killer, the rest of your game is lost. It's really as simple as that. And what made the meta killer so much more valuable than the weaker killers was their mobility. Their ability to get to gens faster, start a chase faster, potentially get kills faster, and therefore have a stronger early game. It's simple, if you get to a gen and chase survivors off it, they're no longer on a gen. Whereas a slow killer with no mobility would take a lot longer to find their first survivor to get people off gens and would therefore lose that early game pressure. Now the beauty of Ruin compared to other slowdown perks was that it was active immediately from the get-go, and if survivors couldn't hit those great skill checks, then their early game is going to be a lot slower than if you didn't have Ruin. Along the line, many other generator slowdown perks were added to the game, like Old Overcharge or Huntress's Lullaby or Surge. None of them made anywhere near as big of a splash as Ruin, for a variety of reasons. whether it's just an easy counter with minimal slowdown like old Overcharge, or having to stack a hex perk for benefits like Condress's Lullaby, or simply overly tight restrictions on how the perk can be activated like Surge. That's not to say that Ruin was the only popular slowdown perk though. Pop Goes the Weasel was a good slowdown perk, but as it had to be earned via hooking a survivor and then manually applying it to a single generator within a time limit, the perk was much more beneficial to meta killers and not quite as impactful to low mobility, low tier killers who needed the slowdown the most. So Ruin once again remained in a league of its own. The bad side of Ruin. Now, not everything was sunshine and rainbows when it came to Ruin, far from it in fact. Whilst being an absolute necessity for killers, its popularity caused serious issues for both killers and survivors alike. Now, the obvious issue survivors had with a perk that greatly benefited killers was frustration factor. Ruin punishing survivors for only hitting good skill checks instead of great skill checks quickly became an annoyance to survivor players for a few reasons. The first was skill issue. Some players were simply not good enough at skill checks to hit greats often at all, and depending on how often they got skill checks, some lower tier players found themselves completely unable to repair generators at all, even without the killer's input. And scouring the map to look for the hex totem can easily become a chore if you've done 3 laps of the entire map already and still not found the totem. The other issue was not directly due to Ruin itself nor the skill checks, but a different design decision behavior made long before Ruin was even added into the game. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the phrase sane defaults before. It's the idea of when making a computer program, website, or game, the developers set the default settings as something sane or optimal. For example, on a PC game, sane default controls for movement would be W for forward, A for left, S for back, and D for right. Well, for Dead by Daylight, the default video settings were insane, meaning they were not optimal and most people would want to change it. Or if they weren't tech savvy, they would wonder why the hell the game feels so unresponsive. The issue was VSync, which significantly increased input delay. By default, it was enabled, but there was also no way to disable it in-game, with users having to edit config files manually with a text editor to disable it. While normally VSync isn't a huge issue, in a game like Dead by Daylight, where skill checks or QuickTime events are such a huge factor for survivor gameplay, it is a horrendous decision to have it enabled by default with no way of disabling it in-game. With VSync enabled, you wouldn't be able to press the skill check button during the great zone to hit a great, as the input delay would cause it to not register the button press until you had already missed it. You would have to press the button way earlier. And the problem with Hex Ruin for killers is in the name. Hex Ruin. Due to Ruin's nature as a hex perk, making it possible for survivors to find the totem and break it to completely disable the perk entirely, unlucky totem locations could cause you to lose your most important perk very early on in the game, with thousands of examples of survivors spawning in at the start of a match directly in front of a totem, and killers losing Ruin within the first 20 seconds of the game. As with most other hex perks, having the totem break and losing out on your perk is a major blow, as now you have to play the rest of the game with only 3 perk slots, which is a big enough disadvantage as it is. But due to Ruin not just being a nice perk, but a core perk, meaning it was practically necessary in most scenarios, losing it too quickly can instantly guarantee your defeat. Long-time players will remember playing hundreds of matches where Ruin got broken within the first 30 seconds of the match, immediately followed by the killer quitting from the game. With a major aspect of your chances of winning being determined by RNG, you can imagine how frustrating this would be for killers who had a string of bad luck, having a series of back-to-back matches with their Ruin being broken immediately. To the devs, it was clear that Ruin had some major issues. Such a major factor of matches being determined by RNG, paired with forcing survivors into great skill checks whilst dealing with the ridiculous input delay of VSync, meant Ruin needed to change. Bringing us the reworked Ruin. In January of 2020, Ruin 2.0 made its debut, with the devs feeling confident they've addressed some of the major issues of the original Ruin while still doing the same job, with the perk now being changed entirely to no longer have anything to do with skill checks. and instead automatically regressing partially repaired generators at 200% of the normal speed if no survivor is repairing them, completely eliminating the need to kick generators at all, with the perk still remaining as a hex. Some of the devs' goals were achieved. Ruin no longer left lower skill players unable to repair gens at all, and it no longer provided the killers with automatic value, now requiring the killer's input to get value from the perk. However, some of the issues remain the same. Finding the totem could still sometimes be a pain for survivors, and losing the perk early would still be terrible news for killers, still more than other hex perks. The perk also still appeared in the overwhelming majority of matches. While it was no longer almost every single game like it used to be, it was still the majority of games. The new Ruin also brought along some new issues that the original never had. The first being that it had nowhere near as much of an impact early game as old Ruin did, leaving low mobility and low tier killers in the dirt, as early game is when they needed the help the most. The other major issue is due to the perk now requiring the killer to chase survivors away from gens manually to get value. Once again, low tier killers and low mobility killers get nowhere near as much value from this perk as high mobility killers, which is an issue that can sum up a lot of modern killer perks. It makes the strong killers stronger, but leaves the weak killers in the dirt. But how did the reworked Ruin still remain on top, dominating the killer meta for the weak and strong killers alike? The first reason is the most obvious. Generators regressing at 200% speed is a really nice bonus for trying to slow down the pace of gens. High mobility killers will be able to constantly scare survivors off gens and gain extreme value, and low mobility killers will really appreciate the breathing room gained each time they do get a survivor off a gen and get some regression on it. The other factor is how valuable it is to make a gen regress the second a survivor gets off it without having to kick it manually. In normal gameplay, if you're a killer and you run up to a survivor midway through repairing a gen, you have to make a choice. Do I commit to chasing this survivor now since they don't have much distance on me, leaving the gen where it is, meaning somebody else could possibly finish it at any moment, or do I kick the gen, helping to relieve the pressure of gens being repaired, but at the cost of distance, meaning the chase will be significantly longer and it could screw my pressure over? Well, with Ruin 2.0, you don't have to make that choice. You get to chase the survivor immediately and get the gen regressing. The best of both worlds. The 200% regression speed is simply the cherry on top. Ruin once again dominated the killer meta, frequently paired with Undying, granting Ruin a second chance after it gets broken the first time in an attempt to make Ruin slightly less of a risk. This continued for another 2 years. Fast forward to January 25th, 2022, a new perk combo finally begins to give Ruin and Undying a run for its money, when Dead Man's Switch gets a buff. Now activating on every hooked survivor instead of only the Obsession, this perk would block any gens that the survivors stopped repairing for the duration of it. Paired with Scourge Hook Pain Resonance, killers now had an effective tool for slowing generators without the risk of losing your perks entirely, unlike Ruin and Undying. Due to the perks activating upon hooking a survivor, the new Dead Man Switch and Pain Resonance combo would reward killers for good gameplay and successful hooks by exploding the gen that's currently closest to completion, kicking the survivor off of it, and then blocking them from repairing it until Dead Man Switch expires. Many killer players jumped at the opportunity to abandon the totem-bound Hex Ruin in favour of this combo, mainly due to the fact that it cannot be taken away from you. Although this new combo did prove to be quite effective, it wasn't without its own issues. Savvy survivors would simply look at the downed survivor's aura, see when they're about to be put on the hook, and then stop repairing the gen before the two perks proc, allowing them to continue repairing without being kicked off and without activating Dead Man Switch. The other issue posed is once again mainly concerning lower tier killers. Those who struggled to get fast hooks would once again find themselves left behind, as infrequent hooks would cause less procs, less slowdown, and getting less value from this combo than stronger killers would. While this combo did cause quite a stir for Ruin, it didn't quite dethrone it yet. The downfall. Only a few months after Ruin's last wobble with Dead Man Switch and Pain Resonance, on the 19th of July 2022, patch 6.1.0 hits, featuring a huge list of changes, including faster gen kicking times, instant 2.5% regression when kicking a gen, and various perk changes, like the overcharge buff, now causing kicked generators to regress at 75% of their normal speed, gradually increasing up to 200% of their normal speed, alongside Ruin's nerf. Ruin's regression speed was halved from the previous 200% down to the normal 100% regression speed. A perk's strength being completely halved is a pretty huge nerf, but that's not all. Ruin also had one new restriction placed onto it. Once a single survivor dies, whether by sacrifice, mori, etc., this perk automatically deactivates without being cleansed. With Ruin's initial rework back in 2020 drastically reducing the perk's early game effectiveness, this new restriction limiting how long the perk remains on play, on top of its RNG totem placement, made Ruin even riskier to use than before, with half the reward. Killers had to start evaluating their other options, and no better time was now. With all of those perk reworks and gen kicking buffs finally making it worthwhile to kick a gen, a new combo immediately took the killer player base by storm. Call of Brine and Overcharge, otherwise known as Overbrine. Call of Brine would make a kicked generator regress at 200% of its usual speed right from the bat, and that would stack with Overcharge's previously mentioned regression speed increase. Having two instances of 200% regression would lead to incredible regression speeds and allow killers to pressure gens without the need for RNG totem placements like Hex Ruin. Some players even combined Overbrine with the previously mentioned Dead Man Switch and Pain Resonance combo, or even Pop Goes the Weasel and Eruption. But two perks remain dominant: Call of Brine and Overcharge. With Ruin immediately going from an extremely commonly used perk to somewhat of a rarity. Although, just like other combos, Overbrine once again brings its own issues. Due to the insane regression this perk combo provides, the choice between kicking a gen or chasing a survivor is pretty much always made for you. Kicking the gen first is practically always your best option now, meaning that killers would have to make do with slightly longer chases in these scenarios, unlike Ruin. The other, bigger issue? Once again, low mobility, low tier killers would not gain as much value from this combo as higher tier killers, as they would have to spend longer travelling to gens, whereas someone like Blight or Nurse could whip round the map at insane speeds and kick gens to their heart's content, applying this perk combo everywhere. So high mobility killers once again benefit from this combo much more than their slower, weaker peers. And that leaves us with one last question. How do you guys feel about the downfall of Ruin? Personally, I think it's probably a good thing overall that killers can finally reliably lean away from the RNG-laden Hex Ruin and actually keep their perks for the entire match, but it would definitely be nice to see some changes that benefit slower killers for once. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you so much for sticking to the end. If you have any other things you'd like me to discuss in a similar style to this video, be sure to let me know. You can catch me live on twitch.tv/Ardetha.